We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kate Lohr, and it's my privilege to serve as the Social Justice Minister here at First Unitarian Church. We gather this evening at an interesting time in our country's history. Never in my lifetime did I ever expect to witness such a high degree of public interest in the day-to-day implications of our free market economy. I think it's fair to say that our country's blind faith in the free market has been inalterably shaken, and that people are finally coming to the realization that economics matter. I know that some of us feel a lot of anxiety right now. We got some bad news that you'll be hearing about. Clearly, the stakes are high because the decisions we make in the coming months will significantly impact the economic quality of our lives, our standing with the international community, and the future health of our planet. So tonight's forum is an important one. I'm glad you're here. For it is the goal of this event to educate one another about the problems with existing free trade agreements and to explore some opportunities for change. Yes, without a doubt, change is a-coming, and it will be defined by the type of conversations that we'll be having tonight. Now, many of you here know that First Unitarian Church has always played a big part in this type of work, hosting forums just like this one in order to educate and mobilize the public in support of a fairer, more just society. Some of you may have even been here 10 years ago for the teach-in that mobilized people to participate in the WTO protest in Seattle. Anybody here go to that? Awesome. I'm happy to report that the church's Economic Justice Action Group has been organizing similar events ever since. It's important to acknowledge just how far we've come over that time period. 10 years ago, most people had never even heard of the WTO. Today, it's the subject of a Hollywood movie. 10 years ago, many people were still ambivalent about the concept of free trade. Today, the pollsters at the Pew Research Center report, and I quote, "There is now broad agreement that free trade negatively affects wages, jobs, and economic growth in the United States. By greater than 6-1, the public says free trade agreements result in job losses rather than in new jobs." So, people in this room deserve credit for helping to bring about this shift in public opinion. The education and outreach and protest that people have engaged in here and around the world has made a real difference. The free trade area of the Americas, which many of us oppose, has been defeated. The WTO expansion, which seemed so unstoppable in the 1990s, has been derailed. Furthermore, and I take great heart in this, countries are now refusing to take new loans from the International Monetary Fund and are creating their own new paths for finance. So, in spite of the troubles on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C., this is a hopeful time. That's not to say that the rich and powerful interests have stopped trying to expand their free trade policies. They are continuing to push them, and it makes sense for us to continue educating ourselves about the dangers in their agenda and to continue organizing against it. But given how far we've come over the past 10 years, perhaps it's also time for us to shift away from playing defense all the time and start playing some offense, if I might use a sports metaphor. Maybe it's time for us to start talking about how fair trade policies could help the economy. Maybe it's time to start envisioning and articulating that what we're going to do together to turn this broken system around. These are the topics of tonight's forum. So let me tell you about what the format will be this evening. First, we're going to hear from a panel of Oregon's labor, environmental, and fair trade leaders about where we are in regards to trade and where we might be heading. Then, we're going to invite some people with first-hand experience involving the problems with existing trade pacts to share their stories and their perspectives. Next, we have invited Oregon House Speaker and senatorial candidate Jeff Merkely to respond to what is said and share his views on international trade policy. We will end our discussion with a short presentation on next steps, including ways in which you can get involved. Now, let me point out that Senator Gordon Smith was also invited to participate in this evening's forum, but he declined the invitation. I'd now like to introduce our esteemed panelists. It'll go in order, closest to me. The first is Tom Chamberlin. He's president of the Oregon AFL-CIO, the state's largest federation of labor unions. The AFL-CIO has been involved in the fight against misguided trade agreements at least since Nafta was first introduced. Many unions with the AFL-CIO have seen their memberships hit hard by trade deals. Tom is going to be discussing that impact and how it has had an impact on job loss and wage stagnation across this state. Next to him, Erica Maharg is the Columbia Group Chair of the Oregon Sierra Club. She has been very active. She has been very active in the fight against free trade deals in her Oregon and has worked for organizations fighting them in Washington, D.C. Erica is going to be discussing something we often neglect in these discussions: the impact that free trade agreements have on the environment, particularly global warming. Next is Ken Allen. He's the Executive Director of Oregon AFSCME. AFSCME stands for the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, and it's a union representing public sector workers. Some of you may be wondering what state government employees have in the trade debate. Ken is going to discuss the potential for privatization of public services and the continued offshoring of service sector jobs if trade policies continue on their current path. And lastly, Arthur Stamoulis is director of the Oregon Fair Trade Campaign. This is a statewide coalition of labor, environmental, and human rights organizations working together to fight the expansion of the Nafta model and instead promote a positive vision for international trade. Arthur will be talking about a new piece of fair trade legislation called the Trade Act and about opportunities for change. I'd like to now invite Tom to come up, our first panelist.
Good evening, everyone. You don't have to, I gotta tell you, I'm a little angry this evening. I'm very angry. You just turn on the television set or you read the Oregonian, and Oregonians, Portlanders, we've been hit right between the eyes with the trade agreement. Right between the eyes. We found out today that in 2010, Freightliner is going to close its Portland plant and transfer over 1,000 jobs to Mexico and North Carolina. Why? The labor market's cheaper. Folks work for less. No health care benefits, no retirement benefits. They're going to go from a unionized workforce to a non-union workforce. And let's think about what Freightliner really means. Freightliner was born in 1930. Consolidated Freightways, another Portland company, decided they want to manufacture their own trucks. So we began manufacturing trucks. And Consolidated Freightways and Freightliner from the 40s through the 90s provided good union jobs to tens of thousands of workers in this state, in this city. And those jobs were a ladder for many families like mine out of poverty. I remember the day my dad stopped working 2 jobs and started working 1 union job at Freightliner. That union card, that job meant the difference between cold cereal for dinner and chicken. You know, Consolidated Freightways fell victim to Reagan's deregulation, and we lost Teamster jobs, machinist jobs. And now a multinational corporation, Daimler, has bought Freightliner. They have wrung everything they can out of the workforce, promised them if they took concessions, they would keep the plant open, and they have welched on that agreement. When Freightliner closes its doors, Oregon will have lost 75,000 manufacturing jobs. 75,000. That doesn't take into account the folks who work in grocery stores that were dependent on those jobs, or in restaurants, or folks who made the parts for Freightliner, or delivered the trucks and supplied other products to Freightliner. Not to mention the loss of revenue to the state of Oregon and our communities, revenues that would fund education or health care or improve our roads. All that revenue is lost to us and is offshore. And nationally, we've lost millions of jobs. And for those of you who are as old as I am, you can remember the debate in 1993. The debate in 1993 was that Oregon was going to get 1,000 new jobs a year. This was going to be a job creator, not a job loser. And at the same time, we're going to raise all boats. All workers in the world would profit from this. Well, that hasn't been the case, and it's really easy to focus on 1993 as sort of the middle class circling the drain, but you have to go back farther than that. You actually have to go back to 1980, when Ronald Reagan decided we were going to deregulate American business and de-unionize the American workforce. To put today's economy into perspective, we should remember that our economy didn't always work the way that it does today. When the middle class was built, when it was born in 1947, right after World War II, and up through 1980, that was a period of great economic growth for the middle class. In fact, the poorest 20%, they prospered the most. They actually made more than the richest Americans. And productivity matched the pace of wages. But since 1980, that's all changed. Productivity for American workers up 67%. And wages are stagnant. America hasn't had a true raise since 1980. And that's true for 90% of the workforce. But that top 10%, those folks who make $1.8 million a year, their wages have increased 181%. And the top 1%, those families that make $6 million, 500%. We live in a time where the average CEO makes in one day what the average worker does. And that wealth, we had the greatest redistribution of wealth from 47 to 1980, it's gone. It's gone. It's back to pre-Depression levels, pre-1929 levels. Over 70% of the wealth of this country rests in 10% of American families, the top 10%. And the top 1%, 35%. American workers work harder and they're getting less. You know, we live in an era where the average citizen, workers, have little to no voice in Washington, D.C. The power is in the hands of the very rich and the corporate lobbyists. Little to no regulation on businesses, and we've all seen in the last 2.5 weeks the result of that. We've seen 700 billion of our money, our children's money, and our grandchildren's money being spent to bail out greed. Pure and simple. It's greed. $700 billion that could have gone to give health care to all Americans. $700 billion that could have created millions of jobs, rebuilding our railroads, rebuilding our education system, providing health care. It just doesn't make sense to me. Trade agreements without consumer and labor environmental standards may have started with Clinton. But I got to tell you, George Bush and Gordon Smith have put the metal to the metal. They have never met a trade agreement they didn't like or provide the tax incentives for corporations to take our jobs offshore. This is shameful. Trade agreements rip apart our families, our livelihood. They exploit workers in Mexico and other Latin American countries and Asia. I mean, what we do with these trade agreements is look for the lowest common denominator, the poorest nations to exploit. And then we turn the American workers against them because they think they're taking our jobs away. They're not taking our jobs away. The rich and the powerful are taking our jobs away because... But we have a chance. We have a chance every 4 years to have a revolution in this country. This is our time. You can feel it. You can feel the momentum growing. We can have a change in Washington, D.C. Trade agreements that have labor standards on there. Treat people with human dignity. I can't say it. We can unionize our workforce once again and recreate the middle class. This is what this election's about. But I have to tell you, we cannot ever become complacent again. We cannot hold our electeds accountable every 4 years or every 2 years. We have to hold them accountable every single day. And if they allow this nation to slip into the despair that we are in today, we will tell them they're gone. Just as we're going to tell them November 4th, George Bush, Gordon Smith, you're gone. And we're going to replace you with a pro-worker, anti-corporate greed administration. Thank you.
Wow, I am honored and awed by being on this panel, and thank you all for coming today. It's amazing to see everybody here tonight. Tom did an amazing job talking about the impact that Nafta and the WTO have had on Oregon workers, and those effects are obvious for many, many people in this room. What I'm going to talk about tonight is the environmental effects of these trade agreements that may be slightly less obvious for some of us in this room. I'm going to talk about these environmental impacts, particularly how they affect global warming. And it's going to get a little daunting, I think. But I'm going to try to end on a hopeful note and how we can turn these trade agreements into a force for good for the environment as well as for workers and human rights. Free trade agreements are worsening our environment and worsening the problem of climate change in a number of ways, and some of which are probably pretty obvious. First and foremost, when companies offshore, they move to countries with fewer environmental controls, and they can put massive amounts of air pollutants, water pollutants into our environment. For example, China's energy portfolio is 40% more carbon intensive than the state of Oregon. So that means when a paper mill, for instance, moves to China and they flip on the switch, they just turn on the machinery, they're spewing 40% more carbon into this atmosphere than they would if they were in the state of Oregon. In addition, because of the fewer pollution controls, they're putting in more heavy metals into the air, which have massive effects on the local people. So that means that when we get our nice, shiny things from China, they get massive public health problems. Second, the transportation sector is a huge component of the global warming problem. It accounts for about 25% of carbon dioxide emissions globally. And we've created this economic system that depends on shipping goods internationally. It has massive pollution control problems. In addition, it's completely absurd, and I like to point this out because it's just ridiculous what we've created. We have ships leaving the U.S. full of timber or wheat or whatever we produce here in the U.S., and at the same time, we're bringing the same products in. In addition, I like to tell this little snippet because I find it completely ridiculous. Fish that's caught off the coast of Norway is actually sent to Southeast Asia for processing and then sent back to Norway for consumption. And only in a world where we externalize environmental impacts does that even begin to make sense. The climate change crisis is a moment where we can all look at our economic system and realize that the environmental resources that we take for granted, like our air and our water, those things that we kind of need, they're not free and they are not easy to replace. In addition, the third impact I want to talk about is how free trade agreements open up some of the most pristine and biodiverse places in this earth. Companies can go in after free trade agreements and suck out all of the resources, the timber, the oil, the minerals, and we leave local economies devastated. In addition, deforestation is the cause of 20% of the carbon dioxide emissions globally. And I heard a startling fact this weekend that the remaining trees in the world have actually become a carbon producer rather than a carbon sink because of the massive amounts of deforestation and the forest fires that are actually releasing all of the carbon that were formerly held in the trees. And finally, free trade agreements undermine our democracy in a variety of ways. They set ceilings rather than floors for basic standards for food safety and product safety. And in addition, many of the proposed policies, the creative policies that we're coming up to address climate change, are actually violations of current trade agreements. So yeah, free trade agreements are a huge, huge problem. And we need a new model, and we need it fast. One thing we've learned from trade agreements, though, is that international agreements can work if they are enforceable. And I think looking at trade agreements and the enforcement mechanisms in trade agreements versus international environmental agreements really brings out the priorities that our global society has held. Trade agreements, if you violate them, they come with massive amounts of penalties, tens of millions of dollars, if not billions, for a country, as well as trade sanctions, if that's applicable. International environmental agreements, as well as labor rights agreements and human rights agreements, rely upon the goodwill of the countries that are party to these agreements. They are someday intentions, and yet the differences in this represent what we have held to be important in our society. And I think everyone in this room probably agrees that we have it completely backwards. So we need to change that, and we need to change it today. I know we all hear the gloom and doom of global warming on a daily basis, and I think that Tom made a really compelling speech, and I think when we hear about job loss, we have a visceral and emotional connection to that. But global warming is real, and it's going to affect the generations that are here today. In a recent article, the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated, "If we allow things to continue unchanged and we don't take action today, it will destabilize human society." And when he's talking about that, he's not talking about 200 years from now. He's talking about 4 people that are alive right now. So, again, we need to change a lot of things, and trade can be a component of the solution for global warming. First and foremost, we need to renegotiate our trade deals. We need to make sure that the environment, that labor, that humans in general come first before corporate expansion. And second, we need our leaders to start using trade agreements creatively. Trade agreements could be used to internalize the environmental impacts of imported goods by putting on, for instance, carbon border taxes proposed within various climate change schemes. We will be better off both environmentally and both for workers. We can recreate a new green economy and live in harmony with this world and be just better off. So finally, we as a country, as a global society, no longer have the luxury of making bad choices. We need to survive living wage jobs in a stable environment, and we can do it. So thank you all for being here and taking the first step.
Good evening. My name is Ken Allen, and I'm the director of AFSCME Council 75, and we represent 25,000 workers in the state of Oregon. Mostly public service workers, but about 10% private sector. I came tonight from a victory party where we organized the workers at the Portland Development Commission about a year ago. We ratified the first contract in a secret ballot by 122-2, so we know we did a good job. First of all, I want to thank Arthur and all the folks I see in this room that have already been the leading fighters against Nafta and the WTO and have already been out there on the front lines, because we wouldn't be where we're at today if they hadn't taken that bold stand. But my job is to talk a little bit about what if we can't turn this around? What's the future show? And it's not that hard to figure that out. All we have to do is look at the past. It's been a corporate strategy in the United States for 50 years to avoid labor unions and decent wages. First, I worked in New England. I represented manufacturing workers. And in New England, all the manufacturing industries were under attack. First, they moved to the south to get away from unions so they could pay much less, and then they moved overseas. And we let those corporations move to the south. We gave them corporate tax breaks to move to the south. And when they wanted cheaper wages, now we're giving them subsidies to move those jobs overseas. And the difference today is that those corporations don't have any loyalty to American workers. They don't care whether they make their huge profits in Massachusetts, Oregon, Montana, South Carolina, North Carolina, or whether they make them in Mexico or Chile or Vietnam. It's wherever they can make the most. And that's what we have to turn around. People wonder about why would a public sector union be concerned? And our concern is based on what we see. And I'm going to go over the technical aspects, but I'll just give you one example. In Tom Friedman's book, he's one of the biggest supporters of free trade. He talks about small hospitals in this country that don't have doctors on evening shift or night shift. They'll take an x-ray, they email the x-ray results to India, and a doctor in India calls back and gives the diagnosis. So there doesn't have to be a doctor on call in the United States that they're having to pay. That's a pretty drastic example. My members attack x-ray technicians and other types of professional and technical positions in our hospitals that are under attack by these kind of free trade agreements. That's just the tip of the iceberg for the public sector, because I know there's a brother here from the Service Employees International Union too. Our members in the public sector, we move a lot of paper, we do a lot of essential services, but a lot of that can be done somewhere else for a much cheaper price. And these trade agreements require that competition. One of the pacts covered by the WTO is the General Agreement on Trade Services, or GATS. The U.S. and 145 countries are party to it. GATS prohibits countries from blocking access to foreign service providers. It also says that governments must treat all service providers equally, so we have to allow service providers from other countries to compete for our work. It sounds pretty innocuous, but there's a couple examples that show the dramatic impact. First, on market access. The United States recently lost a case in the WTO brought by the island nation of Antigua. And under GATS, the U.S. were obligated to provide market access to foreign companies providing entertainment services. Antigua is the home base for a lot of internet businesses. One of them, first and foremost, is internet gambling. And a couple of years ago, our government banned internet gambling. But that ban is a violation of WTO obligations. So the WTO said that Antigua was right with their lawsuit against us, Last December, the Bush administration paid the island of Antigua $21 million so that we could maintain our gambling laws. And then a bunch of other countries said, well, what about us? We're also losing out on that internet gambling. So the Bush administration, they negotiated secret deals compensating the European Union, Japan, and other countries so that they don't sue us under the WTO. And it's even worse. They said the exact details of those compensation packages, they don't have to release those to the public because it's national security. Wow. That's ridiculous. And you can imagine other sorts of service bans, public regulations and zoning laws being a violation of GATS. It's a Measure 37 on steroids. Worse is that GAT requirement that governments treat all service providers equally. The danger is that our government already favors all sorts of service providers. We normally provide public services, but the government that we've been under for 8 years, they want all the services privatized. They don't care whether it's a multinational corporation here operating under a foreign name in a different country that gets the work. They just want to get the work done cheaper. So the threat under these trade agreements is we couldn't block any of the privatization of public services. It's a big concern to public employees because, we've seen what's happened in the private sector, and I don't believe we can have a healthy economy if we don't have manufacturing jobs. I grew up in Oregon. My father is a paper mill worker and a lumber mill worker. I represented manufacturing workers in New England just like the Freightliner workers. We can't have a healthy public sector if we don't have a healthy private sector. If GATS is expanded as the Bush administration has wanted, McCain wants to expand it, we're going to see more movement of our public sector jobs. We understand what's happened with the private sector, but our jobs in the public sector, our average member makes $42,000 a year. That's a decent paying job. It's not great, but it's a decent paying job in this state. And those are under attack. The free traders say, well, don't worry about that. We're going to retrain all the American workers. We're going to find new jobs. Don't worry about the timber jobs that we've lost. Don't worry about Freightliner. We're going to get you some great new jobs. The fact of the matter is that they haven't retrained people into the same $20 an hour jobs. They've retrained them into $8 an hour jobs. We can't afford that in Oregon. There's an economist named Alan Blinder. He's a former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, as well as a former Nafta and WTO supporter. He did a study. It says as many as 42 million American service sector jobs are vulnerable to offshoring. Those are our jobs, the $42,000 a year jobs. He set this up so you can plug in the kind of jobs and where they're at and figure out in your own state how many jobs are under attack. He found that 279,000 Oregon jobs are vulnerable to offshoring. That's about 1 in 5 jobs in our state. 279,000. And when you look at the type jobs that we represent lots of engineers, we represent computer programmers, we represent lots of technicians in the medical field. Those are all jobs that are at the top of his list of the most likely jobs to be privatized. So don't tell me about retraining our members to do those kind of jobs. They're going to be privatized too. We need to pay attention to these kind of trade issues when we vote. I don't know of a more dramatic, easy decision between Speaker Merkley and Gordon Smith. Do we want to elect a politician that's going to help us on these kind of issues? Or is a beneficiary of trade agreements? Senator Smith's a beneficiary of bad labor laws and trade agreements. I go back to some fundamentals on this as far as the labor movement is concerned. We need to have laws that would only be passed by a Democrat Congress and a Democrat President. Laws that don't support corporations moving overseas, that absolutely say no money for corporations moving overseas. We need more fundamentally to say that we won't support any government that blocks trade union organizing in those countries. We've got a long history. We've got a long long history of presidents in this country that have sent troops to the Dominican Republic, troops to El Salvador, troops to Chile, and troops to other countries to reinforce those countries blocking trade unionists, to reinforce those countries killing trade unionists that want to organize for basic rights. We can't afford to elect politicians like that. So when you're making out your ballot, think about these trade issues in terms of our future. Lastly, we need to have clawback agreements, and this is a technical term, but when we give a corporation some kind of a tax break to locate in our community, there needs to be an agreement in there that says that if they don't stay for a certain number of years, say 20 years, that we get that money back. They have to pay us back until they get we will only get those kind of a political movement from people like Speaker Merkley. And I'm glad he's here tonight. I'm waiting to hear from him. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Arthur Stamoulis. I direct the Oregon Fair Trade Campaign. It's great to see you all out here tonight. We've heard a lot already about the problems with our current trading system. What I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking about one of the solutions. Americans are faced with a historic opportunity right now when it comes to trade and the future of this country's economy. The next 3 weeks are a crucially important time, and just as important are going to be the weeks and the months that follow as we inaugurate a new president, a new Congress, and we let them know what we expect of them. I truly believe that today marks the best opportunity we've had in at least 15 years to come together as a nation and make new decisions regarding international trade. You know, when I wrote my talking points, I was feeling very hopeful. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the reasons why I am hopeful that change is possible. That was before the news this morning about Freightliner, and I'm feeling some of that righteous anger that Tom talked about. But change is possible, and we need to channel our energy and our feelings on these issues into making sure that we get change. Let me talk about a couple of the reasons why I think change is possible right now. First off, public opinion and public anger regarding trade and the economy is to the point where it's impossible for most politicians to ignore. In the last election, 2006, 37 newly elected members of Congress were elected on what I would call a fair trade platform. They ran ads criticizing incumbents for their votes on Cafta, for not doing enough to protect local jobs from being moved overseas. And since these newly elected members of Congress have been in Washington, the vast majority of them have held true to their campaign promises. They've stood up not only to the Bush administration on bad trade proposals, but to leaders within the Democratic Party who still haven't quite given up on the failed Nafta policy of the past. And so, while it would be wrong to say that we now have a fair trade majority in Congress, the balance within Congress is clearly shifting in our direction, and I believe that come January, it's going to move even further in our direction. The second reason to be hopeful is that fast track has expired. I think many people know this, but fast track was the Nixon-era policymaking procedure that rushed free trade agreements through Congress without ordinary committee review, amendment, debate procedures. It made it impossible for Congress to fix even the most obvious problems with free trade agreements, and it resulted in the worst trade policies of our lifetimes. Fast track gave us Nafta, Cafta, the WTO, and well, fast track expired last summer. It's dead. Now, it's true that the Bush administration snuck a few trade deals in before the deadline, and those could potentially be voted on under the old rules. But after that, that's it. Whoever's elected the next president is going to find it impossible to negotiate and pass a new NAFTA-style trade agreement without these fast-track powers, and that opens very big doors for us. And the third reason that I'm hopeful was something that Reverend Laura mentioned, and that's that developing countries are saying no to these free trade deals. They're saying no to the NAFTA model. The free trade area of the Americas was defeated. The WTO negotiations have collapsed. Countries are rejecting loans from the IMF like never before. And there's a lot of hope in the world that new trading relationships are possible. So you add all this up, and to me, it seems clear that we're going to see some kind of change regarding this country's trade policy come 2009. The question is, what kind of change are we going to get? Are we going to get cosmetic change? More lipstick on the pig? Or are we going to come together as citizens and residents of this country to demand something more? And so one new tool to ensure that we get comprehensive change on trade is a piece of legislation called the Trade Reform, Accountability, Development, and Employment Act, or the TRADE Act for short. It was introduced in June with about 50 co-sponsors and the support of labor, environmental, and family farm organizations throughout this country. In just a few months, the list of co-sponsors has almost doubled. And the TRADE Act moves us from playing defense on bad trade deal after bad trade deal into promoting a positive vision for trade by doing three very common sense things. First of all, it sets mandatory criteria for what must be and what can never be in any future trade agreement. Second, it sets out a process for reviewing and renegotiating our existing trade deals. And third, it states Congress's intent that fast track is dead for good. And so, we don't have enough time to go over everything that the Trade Act does in a lot of detail here tonight, but I will give you the quickie version. First of all, the Trade Act protects American workers and small businesses from having to compete directly with sweatshops overseas. One of the ways it does this is by establishing what I consider to be the first ever real enforcement mechanism for internationally recognized labor standards and environmental treaties. Erica mentioned, the fact that our environmental treaties, our labor standards, our human rights standards right now depend on the goodness of the countries that sign them. This would put real enforcement mechanisms in place. It would allow workers to initiate complaints and enforcement actions. Another thing that the Trade Act does is it protects working people in developing countries from the agricultural dumping that has forced millions of small farmers off their land, creating all sorts of rural poverty and increased migration, forced migration. The Trade Act also recognizes the rights of both large and small countries to develop and purchase their own generic medications for their people. It allows governments to set procurement policies that favor prevailing wages, that favor buy local preferences, that favor environmental and social responsibility criteria. The Trade Act prevents trade pacts from being used, the service sectors that we heard about, from being used to force privatization and deregulation. It does that very explicitly. It also stops these investor-to-state lawsuits that have allowed foreign corporations to challenge U.S. laws in a process that completely circumvents the U.S. court system. And so the Trade Act does a lot of other things, but one of the other things it does is it opens up the entire policy-making process to more public input and more public oversight. And so in short, the Trade Act is the death knell for NAFTA-style trade agreements. When this passes, there'll be no more NAFTAs, there'll be no more Caftas, there'll be no more free trade with dictatorships. What there'll be instead is the space we need to figure out trading partnerships and trading relationships to actually improve quality of life and living standards for working people in this country and around the world. And so that's a very big change from what we have right now. And it's not only a big change, it's a necessary change. If we want Americans to have access to good jobs, if we want to make sure that our wages and our benefits are increasing over time, if we want the American dollar to stabilize and prevent inflation from running rampant, we need to change our trade policy. And the past 15 years of job loss, of wage stagnation, of inaction on global warming, of inaction on health care, of increased international animosity, all these things have taught us that free markets are no way to organize an economy or to run a government. This latest financial crisis, it puts an exclamation point on what a generation of experience has already taught us. We've known this. And we need real change. The Trade Act is a tool for getting us there. And, we're going to hear from a few speakers tonight who have very grim news for us about what free trade agreements have meant to this country, what they've meant to this city. And, we know this. It's important that we remind ourselves of this because there is a lot at stake. And we have a choice of how we react to this information. We can bunker down and insulate ourselves and try to just survive as individuals, or we can come together as a community, as a nation, and demand something more. And I'm hoping that we'll all do the latter. So thank you very much.
Thank you, panelists. You all did such stellar presentations. Really appreciate it. Now, before we hear from Speaker Merkley, I'd like to invite 4 individuals with direct experience of the local impacts of free trade agreements to come up on stage and share their perspectives on the issue we've been discussing. I'm going to ask Frank Rouse to come up. He's a machinist at the Freightliner truck plant here in Portland. And Mitch Besser, who's a high-tech worker from Lake Oswego. Andrea Cano with the Oregon Farm Workers Ministry, and Greg Pallison, a union official and former displaced workers from the pulp and paper industry.
Is everyone completely depressed yet? First, I want to start, before I push everybody over the edge, I want to thank the panel for allowing us to speak here. Thank you very much. My name is Frank Rouse. I'm president of Local 1005 in Portland, machinist. I've been a union member for going now 22 years. I work at Freightliner. Currently, it's the Western Star plant. That's our product that we do now. I basically want to start with some history of the union at Freightliner. The Portland plant has been, or at the Portland plant, the union has been there since 1947. At one point, it employed 3,200 union members. Currently, it employs 926 members. Prior to Nafta, Freightliner couldn't import trucks from outside the country without going through expensive tariffs. So Freightliner would bring in truck kits, which they would send to Virginia, where they would be assembled on chassis, put an engine into them, and then put them out on the market. They used American workers. Since NAFTA, Freightliner has continued to send production to Mexico and outside the country. Its models that currently they're not currently, but we used to build in Portland, included the Classic, the Columbia, and the Coronado. The last production of the Freightliner commercial truck stopped in March of 2007. 800 union members at that point were laid off, which affected about half the workforce at that time. Many of those members are still looking for employment, and none of those jobs are coming back. Consolidated Metco, which is a supplier of Freightliner, it was also a union shop. Back in 2007, it closed its doors and moved all production to Mexico. There it affected 400 members. In 2008, Freightliner changed its name to Daimler Trucks of North America. In the spring of 2009, they will begin ramping up production in one of the largest manufacturing plants in North America. And if you care to take a guess of where that would be, it's in northern Mexico. The plant is about 760 acres in just the actual plant facility size. I was told by a member that had been there, he said that the actual production line is almost a mile long. So when Arthur asked that I do this, I was just going to give you a brief description of some of the woes and things that we've been going through in dealing with this. But today, at 6:25 in the morning, we got, when I walked into the plant, my wife and I, we both worked there, they said, "Frank, you need to go upstairs, we have some news for you." So as I went up there, they said, "You need to sit down, we're going to have someone come in from the corporate, they need to talk to all the union members." So as I was sitting there, they told us that the truck plant would be closing June of 2010. The Western Star product, which is what we currently build, will be shifted to Mexico. The military, which is one of the other vehicles that we build there, that product will be sent to the Carolinas. The plant closure will affect about 926 members, and Daimler also plans to reduce its corporate facility by shifting or cutting off 1,200 positions there. The employer also will discontinue the Sterling truck brand, which is right now currently built in St. Thomas, Ontario, Canada. They will completely phase it out, and that will affect 800 Canadian workers. They are also unionized. Mount Holly, which is in North Carolina, they will lose 675 union workers, and the portion of their jobs will be going to the new plant in Mexico. At the Portland plant, the employer has met with our business reps and I, and they said that starting in the early part of next year, they will agree to meet with us and negotiate terms and conditions for the plant closure. I wish I had better news, but this is the reality of what current trade deals have to offer our workers. One thing that I ask is that we have to stop feeling helpless. We need to take control, unite as one, and take back our country. We need to call the shots, and we need to tell corporations that they need to take a back seat. It's our turn now.
I'm a high-tech worker. I've been working in the field for over 20 years. I have a master's degree in computer science. And a few weeks ago, Arthur asked me to actually look for some people that I might know who had had their job offshored or had to train the replacements. A pretty common story. And I backed out, so at the last minute, unfortunately, I didn't have any notes. That's how unprepared I am tonight. But he asked me to speak, and I think the reason he asked me to speak tonight was to talk about just how great, these jobs you can move into once you've lost your job. You're always told, you can go right into high tech, right? I mean, that's pretty much the common story. And, he wanted me to talk about what it's like to be a high tech worker. But unfortunately, for the last 8 years, I've been unemployed more than I've been employed. So I can't really talk about that very much, can I? What I will talk about tonight is what it's like to be unemployed and some of the experiences I've had and hopefully can share with you. My son decided one time he was going to come with me to one of these high-tech job fairs. And, as a father, I thought, yeah, okay, it'll be like one of those, bring your, son to unemployment. I don't know how to word it. If you might learn something about looking for work. And I thought, yeah, that'd be good. Of course, he had something else in mind. He had seen me go to these job fairs and come back with candy and little trinkets that they give you, and he thought he was going to collect them up. But, heck, he's a kid. So we went to this job fair, and it was literally packed with other engineers. And we had to squeeze into the room. And I told him to hold my hand because I did not want to lose him in that crowd. So we made our way in. We waited in lines. And at one point, he looked at me and he said, "Dad, you don't stand a chance. There's too many people here. It doesn't matter how good you are or what you know. There's just no way they're going to know about you." And I had no comeback for that. Because he taught me something that at that job fair, which I had not really realized before, as I was being herded into these rooms and trying to fight my way to the front of the line. And that was, there were forces beyond my control. Sure, I could talk about friends that lost their jobs, or I certainly have plenty of stories of people who had to train the replacements, but to me, that's where it got me, and that's why I can share that with you tonight. So, thank you.
State. But he's in Oaxaca, still on vacation. He'll be back here in November. If Santiago was here, he would tell you there are almost 175,000 farm workers in the state of Oregon, migrants, seasonal, and year-round. They're part of the 6.8 million people who were left unemployed as a result of Nafta in the wake of that. They're part of the 1 million farmers who lost their livelihood when the corn dumping occurred in Mexico. They are part of not here, a whole slew of those folks left Nayarit tobacco farms to work for R.J. Reynolds in North Carolina. They left their poultry and pig farms in Guanajuato to work in Missouri for Tyson. And many of them have come here also now to work in the emerging new industries such as the vineyards. He would also tell you that the farm workers here contribute $3 to $4 billion of agriculture economic activity. He would tell you that Oregon is one of the 6 states in the nation that employ the most farm labor. That means people, not machines. That these folks have contributed to agribusiness, the explosion of agribusiness in this state. None of our senatorial candidates have referred to any of that. We've talked about farm business and the successes, but we don't talk about the people who undergird the fields, the orchards, the nurseries, the dairies, the feedlots, the vineyards, the packing houses. Everything that we consume comes from the hands of those people. He would also tell you that these kinds of trade agreements forced those countries, particularly Mexico, not to give any subsidies and to help destroy the markets of those farmers. He would also tell you about what those trade agreements also did in terms of the labor and rights, and also the issues of contamination for them there. He would tell you that there's some movement for some companies to go into Mexico and to set up house there, and that is frightening. Not only do we have the experience of the maquiladoras, and now Freightliner going in, we know that once maquiladoras were set up, there were absolutely no oversight at that end as well, and at some point they also abandoned Mexico and went elsewhere. I think we're talking about a hopscotching of industries and hopscotch over people, and it's very unfair. The other thing I wanted to tell you, just putting on my own hat, was being in Latin America before I moved to Oregon. I was in Latin America in the 80s and 90s, and at that time we had the terms like neoliberalism and structural readjustment. Remember those oxymoron terms. And we started to see the effects of those with cholera breaking out in Peru and Argentina, with streets being just disheveled. Nobody was maintaining streets, and water systems were beginning to fall apart, and this was in the major cities. By the time we got to Mexico, and I was living in Jalisco, and I traveled around Mexico, I'd see whole towns, this is like 95 to 99, whole towns empty except for women and children and old people. Where were the men? They had come up north there. And when I came here, I realized this is where they had come. And they had come here to work in our fields and in our factories as well. But getting back to Santiago, the most critical piece for us here is that he represents a community that is the most vulnerable, not only here, but also in Mexico, in terms of classism, racism, and for many of the women, sexism. And they come here also, not only just crossing the borders, they are actively recruited, and they're also hired by contractors. There's a whole industry of contratistas, we call them. They used to be coyotes, but now it's contratistas, so that all of these American companies and growers and restaurateurs look the other way while these contractors come in and hire the people, take their wages, and are not even dealt with the oversight. So my sense is, of course, as we look at these trade agreements, it's also looking at the other elements within citizen and resident in those countries, the issues of environmental situations, the fact that these countries are also dealing with debt servicing on the external debts that they have to pay, the quote, oligarchies that still exist, and also the markets that continue to be crushed by external folks. The only little example I will tell you is from my WTO story, because I have to tell you that. My good friend Patricia Rumor, who you need to meet also, is the co-chair of Jubilee USA for debt cancellation, is at WTO. There were the banana plantation growers from Ecuador going, and they were there to ask for 1 more penny per pound for bananas. And they know that they had to negotiate something because we don't grow bananas here. We will always import bananas, right? And we will always pay anywhere from 39 cents to 79 cents a pound for bananas. They wanted 1 more penny per pound. That would raise their pay rate for 2 cents a pound. With 2 cents, they had to pay their overhead, their workers, all of the things they had to do there. And they could barely negotiate that. Within 3 or 4 years, by 2003, 2004, Human Rights Watch had charged those plantation owners for major human rights violations, because they did that. So you've got to see the ripple effect that happens in the world with all of this. So all I say is that we continue to be consultative, that we just don't make those decisions here. We partner with people in all of those countries. We partner with labor. We partner with the social justice activists there so that we make an integrated strategy. So it just doesn't come from the north. It's got to come from the south, and it's got to meet together. Thank you.
Well, good evening. I'll say it's thanks for the invite, Arthur, and I wish it was for other reasons, but it's because of what's happening on the trade stuff. I certainly want to say it's a pleasure to see Jeff here also. I think it's important that it's interesting that Gordon Smith didn't show up. I'd like to see Gordon. Actually, I support Gordon Smith. I support him to go into the Trade Act adjustment benefits, and because he would lose his job. And he can see what it's really like. Also, Brad Witt's here for us in Oregon. Brad's been working with us and very helpful in trying to keep pulp and paper mills operating. I'm the Vice President of the Association of Western Pulp and Paper Workers Union. Let me give you a little bit of facts on the so-called free trade agreements that have been affecting our workers in the pulp and paper industry and then the wood products industry. Nationwide, in the last 6 years, there have been close to 195,000 jobs lost in the pulp and paper industry. That's a lot of jobs nationwide. In the last 6 years, there have been over 300 U.S. pulp, paper, and converting mills. Converting mills are the ones that take the paper and turn them into copy paper or whatever. In the last 6 years, over 300 mills in the United States have closed. During that same time, nearly 300 pulp, paper, or converting mills have opened in China. For a number of years, I worked as an electrician instrument technician, and Weyerhaeuser was the employer. In 2004, the mill I worked at, Weyerhaeuser closed the mill, and the reason that they stated, and it was in the paper, and it's usually a canned message they always put out there, was that the mill could no longer compete in the world market. Even though their paper machines are massive, they're huge, and they're multi-million-dollar machines. There were 2 paper machines at the facility I worked at. One of them had been completely rebuilt with state-of-the-art control systems. The other one was just starting to be rebuilt. Again, keep in mind they closed because they could not compete in the world market. Those 2 machines were completely dismantled, everything taken. There were over 255 containers shipped to China, and that mill is now operating in China and is competing on the world market. Why can that happen? There's only 3 reasons I know of. It's because of very cheap labor. Chinese pulp and paper workers average about 70 cents an hour. No pension benefits, no medical benefits. The other reason is environmental regulations. They don't have very many. In fact, the facility where I was at, the paper machine that was bought, the effluent treatment, in other words, the wastewater treatment, now granted, it still needed to stay for the rest of the facility, but they didn't purchase any of that, and there were parts of it that they could have. And the other reason is unfair trade policies that are adopted and passed by our politicians. And with all due respect to all the politicians that are there, I know it's tough times, but I get very frustrated when I hear even what I would consider some good Democratic politicians and friends of mine that push for high labor standards in this country, as well they should, and support them. And they push for high environmental standards in this country, and as well they should. We want the cleanest mills in the world. You cannot make a product without polluting. I wish there was a way. You can't. We want to hold to those standards. We want our forests managed the best they can. And they get very frustrated when we have good politicians that will make it those type of strong agreements, and then turn around and say, China, you can come into the World Trade Organization and you don't have to follow any of those. And let's go make a lot of money for a handful of people. It's hypocrisy, I mean, to the highest level as far as I'm concerned. I want to talk a little bit about Trade Act and the benefits that Arthur has mentioned. The Longview site where I worked was one of 5 sites in the United States that was studied with regard to the impacts of the Trade Act assistance. And so every person was tracked on how many took the Trade Act training, how many went through it, completed it, what jobs they got afterwards. The ones that we know of that did the best after retraining received about 80% of their base pay. And their medical benefit coverage wasn't as good, and their pensions weren't as good. And that was the ones that did the very best. As I said, I'm an electrician, instrument technician. I lose my job, however, if I apply for Trade Act benefits, I get denied those. And the reason is, I'm too highly skilled. And again, those same politicians will say, well, get trained for new jobs. The answer is retraining. Reality is, it's a joke. Now, Trade Act is better than nothing, but how many of you who are working today where you are can go on unemployment insurance for 2 years, school's paid for, and that's the benefit. And if you have kids in college, our average worker was 43 years old, has a house payment, had their own kids in college. And that's the answer. And they'll talk about how successful the Trade Act is. Warehouser, I worked in Warehouser in Longview, Washington, was where the facility closed. And it said, our members got the Trade Act. The jobs were moved to Canada at the time. The paper machine now sits in China. Warehouser also closed the North Bend, Oregon paper mill. Same thing, could not compete in the world market. That has been sold and it's moved to Taiwan. Blue Heron, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Blue Heron paper mill over here in Oregon City, runs 100% recycled paper. Right now, half of the recycled paper in the United States is purchased by the Chinese. The cost has gone up, and they don't care, I shouldn't say they don't care, but they'll pay extremely high prices for natural resources because they don't have them, because their wages are so low. So our mill here now has to compete with that increase. So we're losing jobs. But the other side of it is that the jobs we keep, every contract negotiated that we negotiated as a union is concessionary. Our members there just took a 17% cut in pay in hopes of keeping the place going. And that's not going to keep it going. Eventually they're going to close. Blue Heron bought a paper machine a little over a year ago, almost 2 years ago perhaps, I can't remember the dates exactly, but it was in Pomona, California. They ran it for 1 year. The cost of energy went up, skyrocketed so high, they closed that machine. And that machine, I believe it was 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, was sold and is headed to China. As I mentioned, China does not have the forest resources to support these mills. They get their resources from other locations. Illegal logging in South America alone is over $1 billion a year industry. That's the estimate. Some people say it's twice that. Illegal logging certainly means there's no environmental impact study, having devastating effects on our environment. There's no replanting. It's truly deforestation. And for these corporations that do this, there's no negative impacts on them. In fact, their CEOs are reaping the benefits. They're not only, what I would consider raping the land, they're raping the people of what's going on. And it's very unethical. But yet, they get away with it because they're the ones in control of the trade agreements and they're the ones that are setting the laws. The U.S. trade deficit with China has more than tripled since China has entered the World Trade Organization, and they entered as a developing nation status of all things, which is unbelievable. Under that, China has now become the world's largest manufacturer of goods. For over 15 years, we've been running a trade deficit after trade deficit. To me, if you just look at the United States budget-wise, we have the terrible deficits we have nationwide. People seem to tend to forget the trade deficits and the amount those are. If you were running the United States as a business and you were the CEO of that corporation, I doubt that they would continue to do the same policies they do, losing money year after year after year. You would never do that. But they'll do it because they're taking the resources out of our areas. I want to talk a little bit about the impacts on real quick, like on the trade, on the MTBE. I want to mention this when you talk about the environment. Okay. Canada, MTBE is a fuel additive, and California outlawed the fuel additive, the state did. Under the World Trade Organization, a Canadian company that sells it to the United States sued the United States government for $200 million. We're working with groups on the cap and trade when you talk about carbon and the pollution, and we'd like to see carbon fees that you've talked about. I mean, here we are sitting even as a state, if we want to have the highest, best policies around, it's very likely that under the current trade agreements, that if we were to pass cap and trade on a statewide basis, it would be ruled illegal by the World Trade Organization. I mean, it's just unbelievable what's going on. And that was my last thing I wanted to say. So, again, I want to just emphasize 195,000 job loss. Imagine the headlines that would be there if we said there were 195,000 jobs added to this country. And then the retraining doesn't work.
I'd like to thank Frank and Mitch and Andrea and Greg for sharing your stories. Puts it all in perspective. Thank you. And I'd like to ask Speaker of the House and Senatorial candidate Jeff Merkely to please come up and respond.
Okay, there's can you hear me all now? Yeah. All right. There's so much to talk about, and I'm going to try to be brief because I want to address really the core principles. First of all, look at our country right now and these huge, huge issues that we're facing. We have a $10 trillion check. Did you just hear? They had to shut down and change the debt clock because they ran out of digits for the debt in America. $10 trillion debt. It has doubled under the Bush administration. We are borrowing from Saudi Arabia and China and other countries to float our economy. And this is a debt that then has to be repaid by our children. And I was explaining this to my son, who said, well, Dad, why does President Bush so dislike the children? I thought that was a very good question. The fact is, I'm hoping that I can be elected to the Senate, I can work with others, we can turn this around, and by the time my 10-year-old and my 12-year-old are ready to enter the workforce, we will have put this economy back to work. We've had 8 years of government that is essentially by and for the powerful. And we need to have an economy that works for working Americans. Now, it isn't just what's happened under the Bush administration. We have roots of problems that extend backwards. It's been 30 years, and Tom made reference to this. For 30 years, 80% of the citizens in this nation, the standard of living has been flat or declining. Now, we have produced enormous wealth as a nation during that 30-year period, but it is not ending up in the hands of most of our families. Our families are being squeezed now, where wages are stagnant, salaries are stagnant, and everything else is going up in price, and we have all these hidden costs that are being piled on. Now, I noticed that some of my Republican colleagues like to talk about how they're against taxes. Well, how about the hidden tax from an energy policy written by Dick Cheney that made $600 billion for the oil companies over the last 8 years and gave us $4 at the gas pump. How about that hidden tax? How about the hidden tax that is comprised of Medicare Part D, where our seniors in our Medicare system are the only folks in the planet that can't negotiate for the price of drugs, so they have to pay more than anyone else. How about that hidden tax on our seniors? How about the tax that comes from losing 70,000 manufacturing jobs out of Oregon under Nafta and Cafta? I mean, maybe you pay a little less in taxes at some point, but if your income has disappeared, I don't think that sounds like a net win. You know, in fact, this came up in the debate the other night with Gordon Smith, and he was talking about how supportive he was of programs to give more boxes of food to families who are struggling. And my response to that was, that's all, that's very humanitarian, it's very, very good, it's very nice. But how about creating an economy that creates jobs? And so, the other night, Gordon Smith, I'm sorry he couldn't join us tonight to be part of this conversation. He said, Jeff is a protectionist. And I asked him, what is wrong? And here's the thing. He used the term anti-trade. I'm all for trade. I think one country has copper ore and one has iron ore, and they make different products and they swap them to mutual benefit. That's a great thing. That's a great thing. But a trade system that is designed on different labor standards and environmental standards to such a degree that it sweeps all the manufacturing jobs out of one country, wipes out the middle class, that doesn't sound like a good deal for America or for Well, there are a number of things I think we need to do to help put this economy back on track. One is to fix the unfair trade agreements. Second is we need to end the tax subsidies that actually help subsidize the construction and operation of foreign factories. A third is that we need to stop giving away huge amounts of tax revenue to very special interests, pharmaceutical interests, insurance company interests, international corporations that are not taking those benefits, those tax benefits, and putting them to work for our families, but are sweeping those profits overseas. Now, I found it very interesting to hear Gordon say that the one thing that he's most proud of in his service in the U.S. Senate was a $250 billion tax break that made, well, that's a lot of money, $265 billion tax giveaway to the most powerful international interests. In fact, one company, Pfizer, got $11 billion out of that. And I asked the question, what could a $250 billion have done to rebuild the infrastructure in this country? To rebuild the education system and invest in our children? To create affordable health care in this nation? And Gordon Smith did not want to answer that question. And so we need to end those giveaways that are bankrupting our nation, forcing us to borrow from foreign countries and leaving this debt for our children. Now I want to mention the Buy American Act. I was driving down to the campaign office a few months ago, and I heard that the Bush administration had decided to award the KC-135 aerial retanker contract to Airbus in France. And I couldn't believe, I checked the calendar to see if it was April 1st. Because here's the thing. Airbus was in international court for having been illegally subsidized. And so here, we've taken them to court saying they're illegally subsidized, and then we're giving them a $40 billion contract that may become a $100 billion contract. And my reaction was, what is it with this administration? Do they want to sweep every single manufacturing job out of this nation? And I think they do. That's basically it. It's a vision. It is a vision. It is a vision for a lot of wealth for the very few, and a lot of poor people struggling without benefits, without family wage jobs, and just trying to get by. And that may be a vision that some want for this United States of America, but I believe in a vision in which we have a strong middle class, in which every family has a chance to have a living wage jobs with good benefits, where we all become, therefore, better members of our community, able to raise our children in a way that gives them a foundation for life, able to care for those most in need in our society, and that we all go forward and improve this nation together with that sort of economic foundation. And that is an America that works for working Americans, and that's what I'm going to fight for as a U.S. Senator. So we have a national economy that is in trouble. And it's in trouble in part because of the trade issues we've been talking about tonight. And I really appreciated the great expertise that all of you have been bringing to this conversation. You know, I used to use this example. If you take the state of Oregon and you pick one city and you say there's going to be no environmental rules and there's going to be no labor rules, then would there be any manufacturing left in any of the rest of the state? And I think anyone with half a mind will say no. Because if I'm an owner of a company and I no longer have to pay people overtime, I no longer have to pay a minimum wage, I no longer have to have workers' compensation, I no longer need to provide any benefits or any vacation, if I no longer have to worry about throwing the pollution out of the plant into the stream, then I'm going to make a lot more money. So I'm going to move to that one city in Oregon that doesn't have any rules. Well, this was why when Nafta was being debated in this country, Ross Perot said, you know what, we pass this, we're going to hear a giant sucking sound of jobs being swept out of our nation for the very same reason. It's exactly the same principle. Thank you, everybody, so much.
So, thank you, Speaker Merkley, for sharing your views. Thank you, all of the persons who shared their stories. What I'd like to do now is wrap things up with some things that you can do now to start making the changes that need to take place. So I'd like to call forward Lori King from Jobs with Justice and Joe Carcino from the Economic Justice Action Group of this church.
We've heard the devastating story about Freightliner closing and other stories of corporations throwing people, communities, and our planet aside in their quest for profits. But let's remember that our global justice movement has made a difference and will continue to make a difference. Our global justice movement has come a long way, and I want to repeat a couple of things that were said before because they are great. The WTO negotiations have failed again and again and again. The IMF is selling its gold to make its payroll. The FTAA is dead. Fast track is expired. People in Central America are still fighting against Cafta. We've made a difference. And let's remember that. And also, let's remember that the mood in our country is changing. Lots of people are feeling very angry. Lots of people are feeling that there's a fundamental injustice in our economic system. That's new, that's great. People are feeling that. Tens of thousands of people called Congress. Tens of thousands of people emailed or called expressing their anger at the unjust bailout. We have to take advantage of this moment. We have to use the fact that people are angry and not sit back and realize that we are at a turning point. Let's also get strength from Frank Rouse. I did tonight, hearing his story and it's a devastating story for Frank, for his co-workers, for the community, for Freightliner, for Portland, for the United States, for the whole world. This is really devastating. It's emblematic. It's very, very sad and devastating. But what I get strength from is that Frank spoke about using his experience and is feeling determined to fight for global justice. I get strength from that, and I think we all did tonight. So this is the time to build momentum, and we need to create a progressive agenda that includes all kinds of great things. The Employee Free Choice Act, single-payer health care, the Trade Act. The Trade Act is an essential part of stopping and reversing the corporate onslaught of the last 30 years, the neoliberalism that people talked about. Let's stop the outsourcing of jobs. Let's help build communities in the United States, in Portland, and worldwide. Let's not destroy them, let's build. There are 4 things that you can do to get involved now, and we're focusing on building the progressive agenda through the Trade Act. Joe Cartino of the Economic Justice Action Group here at the Unitarian Church is going to tell us about the first one.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you all for coming. The first thing is that you guys showed up tonight. You came here, you got educated about the Trade Act, and this is, like everyone has said, like the positive vision. The second thing is you probably already signed this petition that says, I support the Trade Act. It's been passed around, and that's wonderful. And it is through the pressure that citizens put on our elected officials that we make change. There's a card out there on the way out, which you can sign if you haven't already, to Congressman Wu, thanking him for supporting the Trade Act, and it was direct pressure by citizens that made that happen. And so we need to get more and more signatures on here so we can move our other elected officials. So please sign this if you haven't already, and also please grab one on your way out and take it to your friends and family. Talk to them about what you heard tonight and just get their signatures on this as well so that we can continue to move the rest of our elected officials to support the Trade Act and make a difference. I know you can do it. There's a table right outside the door with these on it, and there's a sheet that said, I took one, so that we can follow up with you so we can collect these and let our elected officials know how we feel about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. The third thing is that Jobs with Justice is holding a rally and a leafleting action. Get your pencils out. On October 22nd at 4 o'clock outside the World Trade Center, 121 Southwest Salmon Street. And after a brief, fun rally, we're going to be fanning out through downtown Portland at rush hour to leaflet people with scorecards showing the differences in the positions between Speaker Merkley and Senator Smith on health care, on trade, and on unions. Sign-up sheets are going around now, so please sign up for that action. It's going to be fun, and also it's really important that it's a great opportunity to be meeting with the public and doing that leafleting and talking and building this movement that we need so desperately. And it's just a very, very heightened time, so I hope that lots of people sign up for this. Finally, if you want to get more involved in strategizing, because there's lots of need for strategizing about the progressive agenda that we have to create and move, a group of Portland trade organizers will be meeting after the election to discuss where we stand and how to move forward on a progressive trade agenda over the coming months and year. That meeting will be on Wednesday, November 12th at 5:30 at the AFSCME building, 6025 East Burnside. See me afterwards for more details. So let's keep the spirit of the Seattle protests alive. That's one of the first things that we heard this evening when Kate Lohr began to speak. Let's keep that spirit of the Seattle protests alive. Let's fight for the Trade Act and deal a body blow to the Nafta model. The opportunity for change on trade and the economy is enormous now. Please get involved and sign up the sign-up sheets, and see you on the streets on the 22nd of October.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. 3 weeks from tonight, we get to vote. Burn some time.
Hey, Laura.